The Buffalo shooting, Turkey and NATO, and the Disinformation Board. I'm Cecily Fernandez, and this is a Square Circle. Hello and welcome to the Square Circle. I'm your host, Cecily Fernandez. Joining us today are libertarian Regan Ferrell of Young Voices. Nice to have you, Regan.
Hi, Cecily. Nice to meet you.
Progressive political reporter James Rosen. James, wonderful to see you.
Good to see you, Cecily, again.
And conservative David Swindle, publisher of Liberty Island Books. David, great to have you.
So glad to be back. Thanks for having me.
Welcome, everyone. This week saw another horrific mass shooting, this one in Buffalo, New York. Here's coverage from Reuters.
An 18-year-old white male has been arrested and charged with first-degree murder for a mass shooting at a supermarket in Buffalo, New York, in what authorities called an act of racially motivated violent extremism. Authorities say at least 10 people have been reported dead from the shooting, which took place in a predominantly black neighborhood in Buffalo on Saturday afternoon. Buffalo Police Commissioner Joseph Gramaglia said the suspect was armed with an assault-style rifle and body armor when he opened fire in the parking lot while live-streaming the attack on Twitch. Officials said 11 of the 13 people struck by gunfire were black and that the attack would be investigated both as a hate crime and an act of racially motivated violent extremism under federal law. Twitch said in a statement that it removed the live stream of the attack less than 2 minutes after it started and was working to ensure no other accounts reposted the content.
Regan, what do you think will be the lasting impact of this shooting?
Well, first, let's start with a few statistics. So the BBC reports that there are 120.5 firearms per 100 US residents, meaning that there are quite literally more firearms in the United States than there are people. And between January 2019 and April 2021, 7.5 million new gun owners bought their first gun. And so 50% of those were women and 40% were either Black or Hispanic gun owners. I think you'll see another wave of minorities buying their first guns. I think you'll see an attempt from different states, particularly in New York, like Governor Hochul's gun law package, which will attempt to ban carrying capacity, certain types of rifles. In my personal opinion, gun buybacks, those kind of laws don't actually work, and they'll end up being targeted towards the very people that were attacked in this brutal massacre. But I certainly believe that you'll see a reaction in both that term and with gun laws and possibly with content moderation on platforms. And I think it's important to understand that a lot of what we saw with this man on Discord was actually downstream of content moderation practices, the removal of white supremacist groups on things like Facebook, for example. And then you see this splintering where now white supremacists will go on 10 or 12 different platforms, and it's much harder to find for law enforcement one group where they can target or sift out those who might be an issue.
James, what do you think about that? What do you think about the fallout from this shooting?
It's so disgusting. I think there have been 3 mass shootings in the last week, I believe. There was one involving Asians, maybe out in California. It's almost impossible to keep track of. We've become completely numb. We as a society, as a culture, we've become utterly numb to mass shootings, especially since the pandemic. They're increasing in frequency. They're increasing in the number of people killed. Some of them are, a good many of them, many more than in the past, are clearly directed at people of specific ethnic groups or races. But I remember, as do I'm sure the other panelists, Columbine, certainly there were going to be major gun reforms after that. It didn't happen. Sandy Hook. I'm sure my fellow panelists remember Sandy Hook. I believe it was in Connecticut. Am I right about that? I think it was President Obama went there and wept. There were going to be major, major gun reforms after that. If you didn't get major reforms when a school full of innocent, young, totally defenseless children were shot and killed, if you didn't get gun reforms after that, I'm speaking of Sandy Hook, you're certainly not going to get gun reforms when a grocery store full of adults are shot and killed. So I hate to sound cynical, but nothing will happen. American ideology is too wedded to the right to own guns. I myself think it's pathetic. We're the only major industrial democracy that allows, just millions and millions of guns to be owned, including assault weapons and other weapons that are only designed for use by military and police. Even police groups and military groups don't think those kinds of weapons should be in the hands of civilians, and yet they are. So I don't think anything will happen.
David, would you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, I don't think the body count is big enough to shock people, and I think my fellow panelists are correct. That people have largely grown numb to this. It's only 10 people killed, and quickly the conversation will shift to the means, which weapons were used, which social media was used, which live streaming. It quickly shifts to a conversation about technology and weapons and the usual gun control debates. And so forth. So I think people are numb to it because they're used to this same old discussion happening, instead of really talking about what is the underlying ideology and motivations that is causing people to do this. And when you start to get down into those nuts and bolts, why did these people actually commit these crimes? Then it gets much more difficult than just the usual, which guns should we ban? Or which social media needs to be further regulated? So, I mean, Columbine was brought up. Back in my day, school shootings were blamed on R-rated movies. Now they're being blamed on big tech. Instead of really taking the serious question, what is the ideology and the psychological issues motivating the person doing it? Because that's a much more difficult question to get into.
I believe this last shooter, I read one reference, and I'm not sure if it's true early, that he live streamed the shooting, at least part of it. I don't know how that gets done technologically. But I think, I think if that's true, then to this point, it does show that there are other problems. I mean, people, the desire to be famous or infamous, for a long time, news outlets refused to name serial killers, mass shooters. And I think they're still keeping to that. But now, thanks to the internet, these really sick people can publicize their killings by themselves.
And Regan, what do you think about David's point? It does seem the Biden administration did want to at least ask questions about ideology or and talk about outside influences on the shooter. What do you think about the administration's reaction?
I think it's largely pointing fingers at online platforms for something that has been around for centuries. Online platforms do not create white supremacists, but they do allow them some unique tools. I think that there are certain policy issues that, for example, the economy, inflation, that can lend themselves to an increase in this kind of fringe ideology being accepted. And certain Biden administration reactions might actually exacerbate the issue. You'll notice that in his manifesto, he stated that he wanted there to be reactionary gun control laws, that he wanted people who were moderates or traditional conservatives to feel that they were under attack and that they were being distanced from the administration, not being listened to, and that they would be more willing to embrace these fringe ideologies because of reactionary policies. So I encourage the Biden administration to be careful in their decision making.
David, what do you think about that point? You brought up that you think that it is important to discuss kind of the underlying motives and ideology, but it doesn't bring up some very sensitive other topics, such as, influences and social media and censorship and all of that.
Yeah, well, that's the discussion now. Is where is the line exactly between extremist ideology that can't be allowed versus mainstream political thought? And that's a very difficult discussion for us to have on both sides of the political spectrum. Most people don't want to have that discussion, because then we start getting into this talk about, oh, wait a second, it seems like Tucker Carlson is talking about the Great Replacement or these sorts of themes. And this is so, but is this mainstream conservatism or extreme conservatism? And are we going to start talking about Tucker Carlson when we should be talking about other things now? So it's very hard to have that discussion, because both people sort of like to blend their side in with inflating it to be a little bit larger, or to try and bring people in, and it's hard to get into these specific discussions and so forth. Also
this week, Turkey threw a wrench into the proposed NATO expansion to Finland and Sweden. Here's a story from France 24.
He's said it before and isn't ready to budge.
We will not say yes to the countries who apply sanctions to Turkey and want to join NATO.
Recep Tayyip Erdogan remains firmly opposed to Sweden and Finland's bids to join the alliance, with a reference to measures taken by the countries in 2019, when both halted arms sales to Turkey in response to its offensive against Kurdish forces in Syria. Erdogan has also stressed the incompatibility of their support for the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, which it considers a terrorist organisation, as do the European Union and the United States. Over the past 5 years, neither Stockholm nor Helsinki have responded to any of Ankara's extradition requests.
And James, I'll go back to you on Turkey's response. Do you think that they're just looking to get something out of NATO for their agreement to allow for Finland and Sweden to join?
Well, Turkey's objection to Sweden and Finland joining is part of a broader a problem with Turkey, in that Turkey believes that the Kurdish people, who make up there's a sizable minority of the Turkish population, and who have been pushing for independence. This has been a true independence movement that's been going on for decades. They believe, the Turkish government believes that they're terrorists. Think of Ronald Reagan. One person's terrorist, another person's freedom fighter. And Turkey, really alone among all the NATO members, has caused continuous problems in its kind of obsession with the Kurds and the Kurdish drive for independence. Sweden and Finland both, as do many other countries, Sweden and Finland both support Kurdish independence. This is a Kurdish country, by the way, if it ever formed, that would straddle 5 countries. Iran would be one, Iraq, Turkey, a couple other countries. It would be a large country with, encompassing large Kurdish populations. And Turkey, which in many ways has the most repressive government of all the current NATO members. Hungary would be up there now, unfortunately. But Turkey, even though accepting new members into NATO has to be unanimous, as in so many other things, the United States is first among equals. The United States pays a large share of for the defense of the NATO countries and Europe and beyond. And if the United States wants Sweden and Finland to join NATO, which I believe it very much does, I think it's bipartisan, it's going to happen. There may be some back channel deal where Turkey gets more aid or something else that it wants, but Turkey is not going to block Finland and Sweden from becoming members of NATO.
David, would you agree with that? Do you think that ultimately Turkey will not be able to prevent moving forward with Finland and Sweden joining NATO?
I agree with much of James' analysis. I think that was a very good summary of things. For me, I'm really seeing it in the context of Turkey's relationship with Russia, and the way Erdogan has been trying to sort of insert himself as a mediator between the two, between Ukraine and Russia. So it seems to me that Erdogan is sort of trying to do Russia a little bit of a favor here, and not allowing NATO to become a bit more of an issue there. But that's the context that I primarily see that in. That Erdogan is simply he's been being a very pragmatic, kind of clever politician, shifting his direction a bit. I spent many years focusing on Islamism, and he was one of the main key players now. But he's been moderating on that a little bit and reapproaching with Israel, and I think just shifting, trying to see what the new global realities are going to be, for the next decade.
Regan, would you agree with that assessment that Turkey's just kind of trying to throw some support to Russia, but will ultimately give in to Finland and Sweden becoming new members of NATO?
Certainly, I agree with both David and James that there might be some sort of back channel deal. I know that they had mentioned dropping the Western arms embargo relating to Syria from 2019, refugee funding, and Ankara had also mentioned possible military concessions from the United States as things that would incentivize them. Erdogan has a history of towing the line with both the West and with Russia. It is important to note that Russia is one of Turkey's top trade partners, and Russia provides the most energy to Turkey. They have a long history of working together, and Turkey and Ukraine have a particularly long history of conflict. But all things considered, these are relatively predictable responses. When I spoke about Russia invading Ukraine on this show in March, I had mentioned that non-NATO Western allies might be incentivized to join NATO because of the Russian invasion in Ukraine. And I think it's relatively reasonable to expect Turkey to put up some sort of fight with the, whether that's performative or not, with Finland and Sweden attempting to join NATO.
If I can just jump in, add to something that David and Regan said. Erdogan has done a lot more than just kind of try to, trade with Russia, try to be friendly with Russia. During the Syrian war, the Kurds were when we were aiding the rebels who were fighting against Bashar Assad, the repressive dictator of Syria. The Kurds were our fiercest allies, our best allies, and the best fighters. And again, because they were Kurds, Erdogan was helping the Russians. The Russians were close allies with Bashar Assad in Syria, and Erdogan, against the wishes of other NATO members, was helping Assad and the Syrian government repel that. The Kurds were fighting the rise of ISIS, the Islamic State, and other Islamic extremists. So he has not been a reliable NATO country. And to be quite honest about it, maybe it's a bit cynical, the only reason that Turkey continues to be a NATO country is because they're the only overwhelmingly Muslim country, and we kind of need a Muslim country in NATO for lots of reasons.
Okay. David, what do you think about that? And also a little bit more big picture, what do you think this potential expansion of NATO, do you think it will have any impact on the war in Ukraine?
I don't think so. Well, I mean, I can understand how Putin, is not wanting an expansion of NATO, but I think it's still very much up in the air. It's all up to Vladimir Putin for the most part, how far he's going to keep going. So is much of this NATO expansion going to persuade him or repel him that much? I don't think so. Not really. I think he's still largely in charge of the situation.
Regan, would you agree with that? Do you think that, all this talk about Finland and Sweden, do you think that ultimately it's just not going to have much of an impact on how the war in Ukraine is going?
I think these leaders' goals are often overstated, and they will do what they wish to. Putin used NATO as an excuse to invade Ukraine, but it was probably something that he'd been planning for a relatively long time. Erdogan may be forced to pick a side between Russia and the West, given this, but largely he'll decide to do whatever it is that he believes is best for his country. And it's not unreasonable to think that he's overstating these concerns about the PKK in order to curry Russian favor.
Well, finally this week, the White House's proposed Disinformation Board was paused amid controversy. Here's an exchange between Fox News reporter Peter Doocy and the White House press secretary.
So if it's pausing because you think the board was mischaracterized, then the Disinformation Board is being shut down because of disinformation? Is that what's happening here?
Look, I mean, the board was put forth for a purpose, right? To make sure that we really did address what was happening across the country when it came to disinformation.
And it's okay to wait now 75 days.
It's just it's going to pause. There's been a mischaracterizations from outside forces, and so now what we're going to do is we're going to pause it, and we're going to do an assessment. But the work doesn't stop. We're still going to continue the work. The DHS is still going to continue the work.
Okay.
David, I'll start with you. Do you think this Disinformation Board was an idea that wasn't quite fully vetted?
It's been such a tragedy how the concept of disinformation has become just a politicized buzzword at this point. Some of my early mentors in my political career were a bunch of ex-Marxists and ex-communist types, and among them was one of the spy masters, Lieutenant General Yon Mihai Pacepa. And I learned about disinformation from him years before it became a common term. And it's simply information warfare that espionage agencies do. And that it has now simply become a synonym for, oh, this is a political argument I don't like. And that it's become partisan is so frustrating for a concept that is already very complicated. That disinformation isn't just lies put out there, it's truth, and then a little lie buried into it. So it's the idea that this board was going to come out and really untangle something that espionage agencies for generations have been doing very well, particularly the Russians and the Soviet bloc as a whole have been doing very well. I think people laughed it off, and this is the response.
Regan, what do you think about the controversy surrounding the proposed Disinformation Board?
I largely agree with David. I believe that somebody really dropped the branding ball, having the DHS in charge of something called a Disinformation Board gave me Orwellian vibes, and not in the overwrought sense, but the ability for state propaganda and surveillance for a governing body that is largely also in charge of people in cages on the southern border. So somebody really missed the mark on branding. And I'm less worried about, one specific instance, what Nina Jakozowicz's personal stance would have been on a certain thing and how this would have taken shape in the next decade or so, given the rise of another Trump or, another militant leader, a far left militant leader, what this will do to fuel that toxicity and divide between the country.
James, would you agree that the administration seemed to miss the mark on branding?
Yeah, I mean, it's just it's a term that invites ridicule by late night comics. It's unfortunate because I support some of the impulse behind it, but it's just as I support a large part of the impulse behind the movement that came up with the term defund the police, which is probably one of the worst, most tone deaf political rallying cries I've ever heard in my life, and as a student and a reporter of political science. These phrases, these names matter. And because if right out of the gate you allow your opponents to attack the idea, not on the merits, but because it has a stupid name, you really already lost the battle. That's what happened with defund the police. The people who were backing the notion of defund the police never wanted to stop funding police completely. They wanted funding to be used to help mental health, to do other things other than traditional policing. But somebody tone deaf came up with this phrase, and the Disinformation Board is not quite as bad, but it's in the same ballpark. So I hope they come back at this, let it rest for a while, and come back at this, think it through, as my panelists have said, and come back at this with a different approach.
David, would you like to see them come back at this with a different approach?
Not really. I think people aren't going to trust whatever is produced. I think most Americans simply accept that their government's going to lie to them all the time. Sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for not. And that's so no. I think it's probably just a waste of time.
Regan?
Well, I just want to say, I think that statement by David that most Americans accept that their government's going to lie to them all the time. Okay, I think that's the best argument for why we need some sort of initiative, because that belief is the result of disinformation.
Well, we're going to leave it there for now and take some questions from our viewers. Julia Lawrence asks, are people like Tucker Carlson partly responsible for creating the conditions that led to the shooting in Buffalo? And David, I'd like to start with you. What do you feel about that question?
I don't think it's fair to pin this on Tucker. I think that's been a real big exaggeration. I haven't been happy with some of the ideological turns that he's taken, but I think the ideology of the shooter was so extreme and out there. And there's always going to be these shooters that will simply take one of these extreme radical totalitarian ideologies and just take it to the logical conclusion of it and start shooting people. And they're always going to find it some way or another. So I think Tucker is just the boogeyman, and right now on the left. So he's getting blamed for everything right now because he's the most popular. So,
James, what do you think about that? Julia asked, do you think that people like Tucker Carlson partly responsible for creating the conditions that led to the shooting in Buffalo? Well,
you just hedged it. Partly responsible for creating some of the conditions that led to the shooting. So that's about three things removed from cause of the shooting. And if you put it that carefully, absolutely. I mean, Tucker Carlson is a disgrace. He's a disgrace as an American citizen. And I don't even think he believes. I mean, he's kind of like Rush Limbaugh. I don't even think he believes, just like Rush. Rush admitted this. Tucker so far has not admitted it. Rush admitted that he was an entertainer, and he found a way to make millions of dollars and become filthy rich. Tucker hasn't admitted that. But I remember when Tucker was on CNN on I believe he was on Crossfire, if people remember that show, and wearing his bow tie, and he was much less extreme then than he is now. And so I think what we're seeing now is entertainment driven by the desire for fame and money. The problem is that the things that he said, many of the things he says, are very, very, very destructive.
Regan, what about you? How would you respond to Julia's question about Tucker Carlson?
Again, when you amend it with partly responsible, I think he's adding fuel to the fire, but not directly caused it, certainly. Like James had said, Tucker doesn't believe half of what he says. It's mostly about entertainment and viewership. And I think he'll say anything that sows that distrust in his base and his viewership, because it brings them to watching him the next night and the next week and the next month.
We'll move on to our next viewer question. Alfonso Perry asks, which is worse, disinformation or attempts to suppress it? And James, I'll start with you. What do you think about that question?
Well, suppress it by whom, right? For the last almost 3 months, I've been working at a new gig. I'm working for a company that's one of the largest companies hired by Facebook, also by TikTok, Twitter, but I'm working on the Facebook side to fact check claims that are going viral. And I'm focusing on the Ukraine-Russian war. And you really would not believe, and I'm editing in Russian, I'm fluent in Russian, but you really would not believe, we were talking earlier about propaganda, you really would not believe how much of this war is being fought off the battlefield, is being fought for minds and hearts, it's being fought digitally, and how both sides, but much more the Russian, I think it was David maybe who said, the Russians are incredibly good at propaganda and have a long history of this. Maybe Regan said it, I apologize. But, so I guess my company could be accused of suppressing freedom of speech. But what we're doing is we're fact checking outrageous, insane, extreme claims, many of them by intelligence agencies that are, to use a Trump term, just big lies. But they, unfortunately, because of the predominance of social media and the millions of people who follow things on social media, they're reposted thousands and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of times. And so, yes, if we don't use a loaded term like suppress, but rather correct, I'm for correcting disinformation.
David, how would you respond to this? Which is worse, disinformation or attempts to suppress it, or as James would say, correct it?
Well, I think we need to understand what is the disinformation that's really done the most damage, and that is in particular the amount of anti-Semitism and racism that has been incorporated into disinformation. That for years, the Soviet Union and their allies were distributing the learned protocols of the elders of Zion throughout the Muslim world and inflaming anti-Semitism throughout the Muslim world.
Right.
And, sponsoring white supremacist ideas also. So our enemies know that disinformation that works is disinformation that emotionally manipulates people to hate each other. So it's interesting, this topic of disinformation, ties in with, we were discussing the white supremacist shooting earlier. It's one could very much say that those are potentially related. That some of the hatred and conspiracy theories that have constantly been put out as disinformation for decades have potentially influenced in domestic terrorist shootings. It's you can't say for certain, just as you can't say, Tucker Carlson was to blame, but it is part of fuel on the fire, as was mentioned earlier.
Regan, how would you respond to that, to Alfonso's question?
I largely agree with what David and James said. There's certain vitriol that creates more violence in the world, but I do have general skepticism of one centralized body creating the Overton window or those bounds and shrinking that to an acceptable platform.
Well, it is now time for my favorite part of the show, which is the most underreported story of the week. Are any of you just dying to go first? Okay, David, you're up first.
Well, it's a good transition from what we were just talking about.
Okay.
I help out with the Allgemeiner newspaper, and a story that one of my colleagues had yesterday was invading Russian troops destroy historic synagogue building in Ukrainian city of Mariupol. And this is talking about, how the fighting that's been going on today, and this synagogue, in a message posted to Telegram platform, the council in Mariupol, seen of some of the worst atrocities of the 10-week-old war, asserted that the invading Russian forces had, quote, confirmed their shameful status as racists. So since we were just talking about the anti-Semitism that Russia has spread going back to the czars and through the Soviet Union, we're seeing this now in the Ukraine war and how they've destroyed this synagogue. And it just brought to mind, as I've been looking at anti-Semitism in much of a global context, in Russia, the rate of the anti-Semitism in their whole population is 31%, according to the ADL's Global 100. compared to, about 9% in the United States. So it's a much more anti-Semitic culture and country that's being dealt with.
Regan, what about you? Do you have a most underreported story of the week for us?
Sure. There was a program introduced by the police department of Vallejo, California called Report John, which deputizes citizens as vigilantes in order to call the cops on people that are suspected to be soliciting prostitutes and sex workers. Ostensibly, it's to combat human trafficking, but this goes back to my earlier concerns about a surveillance state and really breaking trust in the community where people believe that they're being constantly watched by their peers.
James, last but not least, what is your most underreported story of the week?
I came across an article that attempts to, science has found out why, to some degree, why octopuses, I thought it was octopi, but the headline says octopuses, why octopi, and particularly female octopi, eat themselves to death and torture themselves to death after mating. And they found out that after mating in female octopi, I'm going to say octopi, there is a chemical that's released that basically is steroids on steroids. I mean, extreme amount of steroids that makes them very aggressive. They think the reason the mothers do this is to have a spectacular display of, self-cannibalism that draws predators away from the eggs that they have just laid.
That's all the time we have for this week. Thanks to our wonderful guests, and thanks to all of you for watching or listening to The Square Circle. Please subscribe to our channel and like this video or give it a 5-star rating on your podcast platform. I'm Cecily Fernandez. See you next week.